Today's presentation is using chopped sugar beets in cow diets. I'm Karla Jenkins, the Cow-Calf Range Management Specialist for the University of Nebraska at the Panhandle Research and Extension Center in Scottsbluff. I want to start off today's presentation by making a distinction between sugar beet pulp and sugar beets that we will be talking about in the remainder of the presentation. Sugar beet pulp is a highly digestible fibrous byproduct that's available October to February as the sugar is being taken out of the sugar beets and processed for human consumption. Sugar beets that we're talking about today are going to be sugar beets that were unacceptable for human consumption, and therefore the entire sugar beet is going to be available for the cow. This is just a picture of sugar beet pulp after the sugar has been removed for human consumption. And this is a slide showing the difference in nutrient value of sugar beet pulp versus the complete sugar beet. The biggest differences that you will see is that the crude protein is much lower on the whole sugar beet, and the neutral detergent fiber is also lower, but the in vitro dry matter disappearance, which is similar to TDN, is about 86% and a little higher than the beet pulp. So we're having this presentation today because there are some sugar beets that began to rot and were not suitable for human consumption, and that happens from time to time, and that happened back in the year 2014-2015 campaign. And so we did some experimentation with feeding whole sugar beets that were unacceptable for consumption. So if we can continue to do some of this, we can hopefully ease some market volatility for the beet producer and provide an alternative commodity for the beef producer that may be a little cheaper source of commodity for them as well. So we had that thawing and freezing that resulted in some rotting sugar beets in the 14-15 campaign. And there were various methods that were used to process those beets. I think wood chippers were used and some other types of grinders to try to get those beet pieces into small enough pieces to be fed. In the study that I'm going to share with you, those beets were then brought to the research feedlot after they'd been chopped up, and they were mixed with wet distiller's grains to provide some protein and wheat straw. And that diet was to be limit fed to a cow study in our confinement cow project that some of you may be aware of. And we actually mixed the complete diet that we were going to feed and stored that for 2 months before the trial began. And so the diets that we wanted to compare for those cows was a diet that contained either 20% whole sugar beets or 20% corn, 60% straw, and then 20% wet distiller's grains. And these are on a dry matter basis, not an as-is or actual fed, but removing the moisture on a dry matter basis. These diets were 9.7 to 10.7% crude protein, but we adjusted how much dry matter was fed each group of cows so that the TDN was fed the same in each diet. And this is just a picture of the feed truck mixing that complete diet of distillers and sugar beets and wheat straw. And then we put this in an ag bag and sealed it up. The challenge for producers is that most of them do not want to mix the complete diet as we did in the research trial. And so the question becomes how much straw has to be mixed in order to store the beets. And so I guess while we haven't actually done that particular research, there are a couple of things that I think are important for producers to keep in mind. Removing air pockets is important so that we get some fermentation but not spoilage. And keeping the dry matter content of the pile between 35 and 50% is probably important as well. So one producer I talked to took 20,000 pounds of straw on an as-is basis, so not dry matter, an actual amount, and 52 tons of as-is rotting beets, and mixed that together. And that mixture resulted in a feed that was about 69% TDN, but only 4.1% crude protein, but was 43% dry matter. So while it would not be a good diet to feed in and of itself without a protein supplement, it's probably going to be a very good diet from a storage standpoint. Something similar to this will likely store well and make good feed when mixed with a protein source. So other producers may do something a little bit different than that, but hopefully this presentation will give people an idea of where they might start with that. My suggestion would be to keep track of the amounts of the commodities used to make the mixture, because that will help nutritionists determine what the quality is of what you actually put together and how to include that with other commodities to develop the diet that you need either for cows or calves. So going back to the study that we did, this is the analysis of that beet mixture that we put together in 2015. That was the 20% beets, 20% wet distillers, and 60% straw in that ag bag. And so we did the mix in March, early March, and didn't open the bag until the very end of April. And these numbers just show you some fermentation that went through. And then I also put these same values for the 15 beets up there before they were mixed in the mixture to give you some idea of what they might have been as well. And so you can see that there is some fermentation that did occur during that storage process. The second year that we did the study, we actually used fresh beets that were not beginning to rot, and we did a demonstration with a beet chopper that was being developed. And so what I did in this slide was I compared some of those same fermentation values of the 15 rotting beets with the fresh beets of 16, and you can see that some of the differences include the dry matter is a little higher in the rotting beets because they've already started to lose some of the sugars. And for those of you who have dealt with the rotting beets, you know that they do ooze out a lot of liquidy sugar when they start to rot, so that's probably not a big surprise. But you can also see that the rotting beets were already starting to undergo some fermentation changes that the fresh beets were not. So the difference in the bagged material in 16 from 15 was that we only mixed it with the straw and then added the distiller's grains later when we fed the diet. So there are a little bit of differences between 15 and 16, but this particular slide just shows you the differences between the fresh chipped beets and then that bagged mixture of 16. This slide shows the performance after 2 years of feeding a complete chopped up beet in a diet to maintain pregnant cows in confinement. These cows were due to calve in July, and so this trial ran from April to June, just trying to catch that last part of gestation before they began to calve. And there was no significant difference between initial body weight or body condition score when they started the trial. There were not treatment differences in June when we weighed them off the trial, but you can see that both groups gained a little condition score on these diets, and this is comparing using corn as 20% of the diet on a dry matter basis or using the sugar beets as 20% of the diet. And so either of those sources did not differ in the response that the cattle had to them, but you can see that they did gain a little condition on that. I think there are some cautions for feeding chopped beets that producers need to be aware of. Number one, the pieces need to be small enough to prevent choking. The good news is that the rotting beets tend to be softer than the fresh beets and probably pose less of a hazard for choking. The other caution would be that beets that have been handled several times on a dirt surface may have picked up quite a bit of ash content. And if the beets themselves are included at a very high level in the diet, could cause some problems for the cattle. But I think that if producers, regardless of how they mix the beets for storage, if the dry matter, not the actual amount, but the dry matter percent of just the beets in the final diet is between 20 and 30% of that final diet dry matter, they should probably be able to avoid any problems that they might have with ash contamination or other issues with feeding. So in conclusion, sugar beets make an acceptable energy source for maintaining gestating cows in this particular study. And I would add that extension educators and specialists can help develop diets using the sugar beets that aren't acceptable for human consumption in a diet for either growing calves or mature cows. If you have questions, or I can send you some information that we do have on feeding sugar beets, you can email me at kjenkins2@unl.edu.